Evenin, friends. The fire's burnin' low tonight. Just a small ring of coals now, orange and soft, barely enough to warm the palms if you hold them out close. The kind of fire that doesn't ask much of you. Just a little company, maybe. A little patience, while it does its quiet work of turning wood back into dust and heat, and that thin ribbon of smoke that curls up and disappears somewhere between the juniper branches and the first band of stars. I can smell the sage out there beyond the firelight, that dry, clean smell that gets stronger after sundown when the air cools and the ground gives back what it held all day long. There's no wind to speak of tonight, just the smallest kind of movement, the kind you feel more on the back of your neck than you hear with your ears, like the desert itself is breathing slow, the way a horse breathes when it's finally settled down for the night. That long, steady pull of air through the nostrils, that soft push, back out again. I've been sitting here a while already. Set the coffee down about an hour ago, and it's gone cool in the tin, but I don't mind. Some nights are better for sitting than for drinking. Some nights you just let things be what they are, and you find that's enough. There's a cricket somewhere behind me, off in the brush near where the old fence line used to run, before it fell over and nobody bothered to set it right again. He's been going steady since the last of the daylight drained off the mesa to the west. Just that one note, over and over, not hurried, not lazy, just keeping his own time the way he always has. I suppose that's what got me thinking tonight. Keeping time, the way things repeat themselves, the way certain nights come around again in your memory, even though you never asked them to. Not because anything particular happened, not because anybody got hurt, or saved, or lost, just because the feel of the air was right, and the light was a certain way, and the quiet was so full of itself that it pressed up close against you like a wool blanket pulled to the chin. I'm thinking about the summer of 1887, late summer, the kind of August that stretches itself thin and golden across the valley floor, when the days are still long, but the shadows come earlier than they did in July, and you can feel in your bones that the season is starting to lean towards something else. Not fall yet, not by a good stretch, but a leaning, like a fence post that's been standing upright for years, and one day you notice it's tilting a few degrees south, and you realize it's been tilting that way for a while now. You just hadn't paid attention. I was young then, deputy sheriff of Cottonwood Creek, which sounds grander than it was. Cottonwood Creek wasn't much more than a wide spot along the road that ran east from the territorial line, a place where enough buildings had gathered in a row that folks decided it deserved a name. We had the Mercantile, the Livery, a saloon that served whiskey you wouldn't wish on a man you disliked, a small church that doubled as the schoolhouse 3 days a week, and the jail, which was really just a single room with a desk, a stove, a cot in the corner, and one cell with iron bars that had been hauled in by wagon from somewhere south. Nobody could remember exactly where. My job, most nights, was just to be there, to be present in the way that a lantern is present on a porch, not doing much of anything specific, just putting out a little light so folks know somebody's keeping watch. Sheriff Dalton, he was the one who explained it to me that way. He said, "Boy, half this job is just being visible. The other half is being still." And he was right about both halves. That particular evening, the one I keep coming back to in my mind, started the way most of them did. I came in through the back door of the jail office just after supper. The light was going amber outside, that thick golden light that sits heavy on the rooftops and the hitching posts, and the dust of the road like honey poured slow from a jar. The shadows were getting long. My own shadow, when I crossed a little strip of yard between the back step and the woodpile, stretched out ahead of me thin and tall, like it was in a hurry to get somewhere I hadn't decided to go yet. I set my hat on the peg by the door. I remember that. The peg was a square-cut nail driven crooked into the door frame, and every time I hung my hat on it, the brim would slip a little to the left, and I'd have to nudge it back. I did that without thinking, the way you do something you've done 1,000 times. The nail had worn a small groove into the leather of the brim where it always rested, and I could feel that groove with my thumb when I adjusted it. Little things like that. You don't notice them at the time, but years later, they come back sharper than the big things. Sharper than faces sometimes. The desk was where I'd left it that morning, which is to say it was right where it always was, pushed against the east wall, with the one window above it that let in whatever light the day had to offer. There was a stack of paperwork on the left side. Nothing urgent, just the kind of forms and notices that accumulated the way dust accumulates, slowly and without anyone's particular attention. A pen and an inkwell sat to the right, and between them, a blotter that had gone so dark with dried ink it looked almost black, like a little square of night sky lying flat on the wood. I pulled the chair out and sat down. The chair had a creak in it, always the same creak, a sound like a door hinge that needs oiling, and it came at the same point in the motion every time, right when my weight settled fully onto the seat. I'd been meaning to fix that creak for months. Never did. Some things just become part of the furniture of your life, and after a while, you stop hearing them as problems and start hearing them as something closer to company. The stove was cold. No need for it that time of year. The heat of the day still clung to the walls and the floorboards, and the room held a warm, dry stillness that smelled of old wood and iron and the faintest trace of lamp oil from the lantern that hung just inside the front door. That lantern was my first order of business most evenings. Not because the light was needed yet, the sun hadn't fully gone, but because tending to it was the start of the routine, and the routine was the shape of the evening, and the shape of the evening was what kept everything in its right place. I stood up from the desk and went to the lantern. It was a common model, nothing special, a brass frame with a glass chimney that had been cleaned so many times it had a faint cloudiness to it, like breath on a window in winter. The wick was trimmed short from the night before. I lifted the chimney, set it on the shelf beside the door, and reached into my vest pocket for the matchbox I carried there. The matches were the kind with the blue tips, and I drew one out and struck it against the side of the box, and the flame jumped up quick and bright, and I touched it to the wick and watched the fire take hold. There's a moment, right when a lantern catches, before you've adjusted the wick, when the flame is too tall and too eager, and the light it throws is unsteady, jumping around the walls in a way that makes the room look like it's moving. Everything shifts. The corners deepen. The ceiling lifts. And then you turn the little brass wheel that controls the wick, and you bring the flame down to where it belongs. And the light steadies, and the room settles back into itself. And everything is still again. I did that. Brought the flame down low, set the chimney back over it, and hung the lantern on its hook by the door. The light it gave was warm and round, not reaching very far, just enough to fill the front corner of the room and put a yellow glow on the floorboards and the edge of the desk. The rest of the office stayed in a kind of half-dark that was comfortable, the way a jacket is comfortable when it's been worn enough to soften at the elbows and the collar. Then I went to the front door and opened it. The porch of the jail faced Main Street, which is where I did most of my watching from. There were 2 chairs out there, wooden slat-back chairs that had been painted green once upon a time, but had faded to a kind of gray-green, the color of sage leaves. I pulled one of them forward a few inches, just enough to angle it so I could see down the street in both directions without turning my head too far, and I sat down. Main Street at that hour was a slow thing. The merchants had already pulled their displays inside. I could see the closed door of the mercantile across the way, and the small hand-lettered sign that hung crooked in the window saying something about flower prices that I'd read so many times I could picture every letter without looking. Next to the mercantile was the barber's shop, dark now, the striped pole out front throwing a thin shadow across the boardwalk. And beyond that, further down the saloon, where I could hear the piano going, but softly, just a few notes here and there. Not a tune, so much as someone finding their way toward a tune, trying out phrases the way you try on a pair of boots, testing the fit. The light was fading. The sky to the west had gone from gold to a deeper shade, something between copper and rust, and the buildings along the street had taken on that flatness they get when the sun drops behind the ridge, where everything looks like a painting of itself rather than the real thing. The dust on the road was pale and even, undisturbed, like a bedsheet smoothed flat by a careful hand. Nobody was moving out there. A dog had been lying in front of the feed store earlier, but it had wandered off somewhere, probably under a porch, to sleep. I could hear the faint creak of a sign swinging on its chain down near the livery, the one for the blacksmith, though I couldn't see it from where I sat. Just that small rhythmic sound, like the ticking of a clock made of wood and iron and air. I leaned back in the chair and let my hands rest on my knees. The leather of my boots was warm where the last of the sunlight had touched them. I could feel the grain of the wood through my trousers, the slats of the chair pressing their parallel lines against the backs of my thighs. And I thought about nothing in particular. Just sat, just breathed. Just let the evening come on at its own pace, which was slow, the way evenings always were in Cottonwood Creek, as if time itself was in no hurry to get anywhere and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. After a while, I got up and went back inside. The paperwork on the desk wasn't going to do itself, though I confess I had no great desire to do it either. Most of it was just the daily ledger, a record of what had happened and what hadn't, which in Cottonwood Creek was usually a short list either way. I dipped the pen, tapped the excess ink on the rim of the well, the way Sheriff Dalton had taught me, and began to write. The date, first, August the 14th, 1887. Then the weather, which I always noted even though nobody had asked me to. Clear and hot, I wrote. Cooling after sundown. Wind light from the southwest. Then the report itself, which amounted to a few lines about the day's events, or lack thereof. No disturbances. No visitors to the cell. Received notice from the territorial office regarding fence line disputes south of Miller's Creek. Filed accordingly. I wrote slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because I liked the feel of the pen moving across the page, the scratch of the nib on the rough paper, the way the ink pooled at the beginning of each letter and thinned as the stroke carried it forward. Writing in a ledger was one of the parts of the job I found most settling. There was a completeness to it, a sense that the day had been accounted for, that whatever had passed through those hours had been acknowledged and set down in a form that would last, even if what it recorded was nothing more remarkable than a clear sky and a quiet street. When I finished, I set the pen down and blew gently across the page to dry the ink. Then I closed the ledger and placed it in the drawer, which I did every night, always the same drawer, the one on the upper left that stuck slightly when you pulled it and required a small lift to slide it back in. I took the cloth from the shelf above the desk, the one I used for wiping surfaces, a square of cotton that had once been part of something else, a shirt maybe, or a curtain. I couldn't remember, and I ran it over the desktop in slow circles. Not because the desk was dirty, but because the motion of it was calming, and because there is a kind of dignity in taking care of a thing even when it doesn't strictly need taking care of. The wood under the cloth was smooth and dark, worn by years of elbows and forearms and paperwork, and the slow friction of daily use. I could feel the grain of it through the fabric, the long, shallow channels that ran the length of the plank, and I followed them with the cloth the way water follows the bed of a creek, not choosing the direction so much as accepting it. When the desk was done, I folded the cloth and set it back on its shelf, and I crossed to the cell door. The cell was empty, as it had been for the better part of 2 weeks. The iron bars were cool to the touch, even in that late summer heat. I tested the latch not because I expected it to be anything other than locked, but because testing the latch was part of the routine, and the routine was what I was there to uphold. The lock turned cleanly. The bolt slid into its housing with a solid sound, and I let go and wiped my palm on my trouser leg, because the iron always left a faint smell on the skin, like pennies or rain on a tin roof. The hinges of the cell door were next. I checked each one, pressing my thumb against the pin to make sure it was seated properly, feeling for any looseness or wobble that might indicate wear. There was none. The hinges were solid, as they'd always been, thick and heavy and black with the kind of age that comes from being made well in the first place and then left alone to do their work without interference. I remember thinking, not for the first time, that a good hinge was one of the most honest things a man could encounter. It either held or it didn't. There was no bluffing a hinge. Back on the porch, the sky had deepened further. The copper was gone now, replaced by a kind of violet that spread from the horizon upward, like ink soaking into cloth. The first stars were showing faint ones, the kind you have to look slightly away from to see clearly, the ones that vanish when you look straight at them and reappear when you don't. I'd learned that trick as a boy, though I couldn't recall who taught it to me. Someone older, someone patient, the kind of person who knew that some things can only be seen from the side. The piano in the saloon had gone quiet. I hadn't noticed exactly when it stopped, which is how it usually was with sounds like that. They didn't end so much as thin out, getting softer, and further apart, until the silences between the notes were longer than the notes themselves. And then, at some point, you realized you'd been listening to nothing for a while and hadn't known it. In the quiet that followed, the street settled into its nighttime character. The buildings looked different after dark, not smaller exactly, but flatter, like cutouts propped against the sky. The boardwalks on either side of the road were pale strips of wood that caught whatever light the sky still held, and between them, the road itself was a dark channel, featureless and still. If you stared at it long enough, it started to look like water, like a slow river of dust running through the center of town, with buildings for banks. I picked up the lantern from inside the door and carried it out to the porch. This was something I did every night around this time, placing the lantern on the small shelf that was fixed to the railing, the shelf that had been put there for exactly this purpose by whoever had built the jail porch years before I arrived. The lantern sat there well, its base fitting into a shallow depression that had been worn into the wood by the repeated placement of the same object in the same spot, night after night, year after year. I adjusted the wick, bringing the flame up just a touch so that the light would reach a little further down the boardwalk. And then I sat back down. That was when the lantern flickered. Not a gust, not a draft finding its way through a crack in the chimney glass. Just a flicker, a brief dimming and brightening that lasted maybe half a breath, as if the flame had hesitated, had paused in its burning, the way a man pauses in the middle of a sentence when he's forgotten the next word. The light dipped. The shadows leaned in from the edges of the porch, and then the flame came back, steady as before. I watched it, not alarmed, not even particularly curious, just watching, the way you watch any small thing that interrupts a pattern you've grown accustomed to. The flame burned even and upright behind the glass, throwing its warm circle onto the boards and the railing and the toes of my boots. Nothing was wrong with it. The oil was fresh, the wick was trimmed, the chimney was clean. Sometimes lanterns just did that. A pocket of air in the oil maybe, or some tiny imperfection in the wick that the flame encountered and had to work its way past. Nothing to wonder about really, but I kept watching. And a minute or so later, it happened again. The same kind of flicker, that same brief hesitation, as though the flame had drawn a breath and held it for just a moment before letting it go. The shadows pressed in and then retreated, and the light was steady once more, twice. The lantern had flickered twice. Now, I'm not a superstitious man, and I wasn't one then either. I didn't take it as a sign of anything. I didn't read meaning into the way the flame had dimmed and recovered, the way some folks might have, the way old Mrs. Harlan at the boarding house certainly would have if she'd been there to see it. She had a whole catalog of beliefs about lanterns and candles and what their behavior portended, most of which she'd brought with her from somewhere back east, and none of which I put much stock in. But I will say this. That second flicker caught my attention in a way the first one hadn't. Not because I thought it meant something, but because the repetition of it, the fact that the same small interruption had occurred in the same way, at roughly the same interval, gave it a quality of intention that I couldn't quite dismiss. It was like hearing your name spoken in a room where nobody's talking. You know it's just the wind, or the timbers settling, or the sound of your own thoughts playing tricks. But you listen closer after that. You pay a different kind of attention. So, I sat there on the porch with my hands on my knees and I paid attention. Not to anything in particular, just to the night, the way it was assembling itself around me, piece by piece, sound by sound, shadow by shadow. The way the darkness filled in the spaces between the buildings, like water rising in a basin, slow and level, finding its own height. The way the air had cooled enough, now that I could feel it on my forearms, where I'd rolled my sleeves up earlier. A soft coolness that carried the smell of dust and dried grass and something else, something green and faintly sweet that I always associated with the cottonwood trees down by the creek, though at that distance, I couldn't be sure that's where it was coming from. The street was fully dark now, except for what light came from the saloon windows down the way, a warm yellowish glow that spilled across the boardwalk and onto the road in two long rectangles. And from my lantern, which cast its smaller circle on the jail porch and a little ways beyond, between these points of light, the darkness was complete, not threatening, not heavy, just present, the way darkness always is in a small town after the last of the day is gone, a darkness that felt more like privacy than like absence. I stood up after a while and walked to the edge of the porch. The boards had a particular sound underfoot, a hollow quality that came from the space between the planks and the ground beneath, a space where dust collected and small creatures sometimes sheltered during the heat of the day. I could feel each board flex slightly under my weight, a small div that was barely perceptible, but that I noticed, the way you notice anything you've felt 1,000 times before, not consciously, but somewhere deeper, in the muscles of your feet and the bones of your ankles, a familiarity so complete it was almost like a conversation between my body and the wood. I stepped down off the porch onto the road. The dust was cool and soft under my boots. It had that particular texture it gets after a day of heat and no rain, fine and almost silky, like flour that's been sifted too many times. My footsteps made no sound in it, or nearly none, just a whisper of displacement, the dust parting and settling back in a way that left shallow prints that would be gone by morning, smoothed away by whatever small breeze came through in the early hours. Walking Main Street at night was one of the things I did as a matter of course. Not a patrol exactly, because a patrol implies something to patrol against, and most nights, there was nothing. It was more of a walk, a slow passage from one end of town to the other and back, checking doors, noting lights, listening. Sheriff Dalton called it making rounds, but to me, it always felt more like visiting, like stopping in on each building the way you might stop in on a neighbor, just to see that everything was as it should be. I started at the east end, where the road narrowed slightly and the last building before open country was the feed store, a squat, solid structure with a double door that was always padlocked at night. I tried the padlock out of habit, wrapping my fingers around the body of it and pulling down gently. It held. The metal was cool and slightly rough with the beginnings of rust that never quite took hold, because someone, the owner I assumed, oiled it regularly. I let go and wiped my hand on my trousers and moved on. The boardwalk ran along the front of the buildings, raised about a foot off the level of the road, and I stepped up onto it with a motion that was so practiced It required no thought at all. The slight lift of the foot, the placement on the edge of the first plank, the shift of weight forward and up. The boards here were older than the ones on the jail porch, rougher, with wider gaps between them, through which I could sometimes see the ground below, dark and littered with small debris. Bits of straw and paper and the broken stem of a clay pipe that had been there for as long as I could remember. I didn't go in. My presence in the saloon, even as a deputy, tended to change the atmosphere in ways that weren't useful. People got quieter or louder depending on their temperament and their conscience. And either way, the natural ease of the place was disrupted. So I passed by, noting the light and the sounds and the general sense of orderly recreation. And I moved on. At the far end of the street, where the road widened again and the last of the buildings gave way to open ground, I stopped and stood for a moment, looking out. The land beyond town was vast and dark, a rolling stretch of prairie that faded into the distance without any clear boundary, just a gradual deepening of shadow until the ground and the sky became indistinguishable from each other. The stars were brighter here, away from the lantern light and the window glow, and there were more of them than seemed possible. A whole field of them scattered across the sky in clusters and streams and solitary bright points that pulsed with a faint, slow rhythm, like heartbeats seen from very far away. I could hear the grass out there, not individual blades, of course, but the collective sound of the prairie at night, a continuous soft rushing that rose and fell with the movement of air across the land, like the sound of a distant creek, or like breathing, slow and vast, and utterly indifferent to anything happening in the small cluster of buildings behind me. It was a sound I'd grown up with, living here in Cottonwood Creek, and it was as familiar to me as my own pulse, but it never lost its capacity to make me feel small. And I mean that in the best way. Small in the way that is restful. The way a man can feel small sitting beside a wide river or standing at the edge of an ocean where the scale of the world reduces the size of your troubles to something manageable. Something you can hold in one hand and examine without being overwhelmed by it. I turned and walked back. The return trip was always different from the outgoing one. Not in the route, which was the same, but in the feeling. Going out, there was a purpose, however mild, a sense of checking and confirming. Coming back, that purpose was satisfied, and what remained was just the walking itself, the movement of legs, and the sound of boots, and the passage of buildings on either side, each one confirmed in its place, each one quiet and settled and needing nothing from me. Back at the jail, the lantern was still burning on its shelf. I could see it from halfway down the street, a small, warm point of light that marked my place in the arrangement of the town, the way a candle in a window marks a home. I climbed the porch steps. 1, 2, 3, each one giving its own particular creak under my weight, and I sat back down in the chair and looked at the lantern. The flame was steady, perfectly steady. No flicker, no hesitation, just a clean, upright burn that threw its circle of light on the boards and the railing and the edge of the road. I watched it for a good while, waiting without waiting, if that makes any sense, just sitting in the presence of the flame with an openness to whatever it might do, the way you sit beside a sleeping dog and watch its ribs rise and fall without any expectation that it will wake, just attending to the fact of its breathing, its quiet persistence in the business of being alive. The lantern did not flicker again. I'm not sure how long I sat there. Time had that quality it gets on very still nights, where it seems to pool rather than flow, gathering in the low places of your attention, like water in a hollow, deepening without moving. The stars shifted overhead, as they do, but so slowly that you couldn't see the movement, only notice after a while that the pattern had changed, that a constellation you'd been looking at earlier had drifted to a different part of the sky, and you couldn't say exactly when it had happened. At some point, I became aware of a sound I hadn't noticed before, or perhaps it had only just begun. A soft, rhythmic creaking that came from somewhere down the street, and after a moment, I placed it as the rocking chair on the porch of the boarding house, 3 buildings down. Someone was sitting in it, rocking slowly back and forth, and the chair was talking the way old chairs do, with a measured, unhurried complaint that sounded more like contentment than protest. I couldn't see who it was. The boarding house porch was outside the reach of my lantern light, and whoever sat there was just a presence, a sound, a gentle accompaniment to the night. I liked that. The knowledge that someone else was up, someone else was sitting in the dark and looking at the same stars and breathing the same air and finding the same peace in it. There was a companionship in that, a quiet solidarity between 2 people who had chosen not to sleep just yet, who had decided instead to spend a little more time with the evening before letting it go. The rocking continued, steady and slow, and I let it become part of the night, the way the cricket and the distant grass sounds and the faint smell of sage had already become part of it, woven into the fabric of the hour so seamlessly that removing any one of them would have changed the whole texture of the thing. The way removing a single thread from a piece of cloth changes the pattern even if you can't say exactly where the thread was. I thought about the lantern then, about the 2 flickers, not with any great intensity of thought, not turning it over and analyzing it, but just holding it lightly in my mind the way you hold a smooth stone you've picked up from a riverbed, feeling its weight and its coolness and its roundness without any intention of doing anything with it. 2 flickers, 2 small interruptions in the steady business of burning, and then nothing. The flame had found its rhythm again and kept it, and whatever had caused those 2 brief falters had passed without consequence, without explanation, without needing either. And I thought, as I sat there, that this was maybe the truest thing about the work I did. Not the keeping of order, not the checking of locks, not the writing in the ledger, though all of that mattered in its way. The truest thing was the watching. The sitting still and paying attention to whatever the night chose to show you, even if what it showed you was nothing more than a flame that dipped twice and then burned steady. Even if the only event of the whole evening was a shadow that leaned in and then retreated, a brief darkening at the edges of the light that lasted no longer than a held breath and left no trace. Because that was enough. That was the whole of it some nights. A lantern on a shelf, a flame that wavered and then didn't. A man in a chair, watching, and the night all around him, patient and wide and full of small sounds that asked nothing of anyone. I went inside after a while and poured myself a cup of water from the pitcher on the shelf. The water was tepid, flat, tasting faintly of the clay vessel that held it. But it was welcome. I drank it standing by the window, looking out at the strip of street visible from that angle, which was just the near edge of the road and the corner of the boardwalk and the dark shape of the hitching post where no horse stood. Then I crossed to the cell again, not because I had any reason to, but because it was part of the pattern, and the pattern was what gave the evening its structure. The cell was as I'd left it. The cot inside was made up neat. The thin blanket, folded at the foot, the pillow, which was really just a sack of straw, sitting square at the head. The moonlight was beginning to find its way through the small high window of the cell, a pale rectangular patch on the floor that would shift and lengthen as the moon climbed. And by the time I came back for my last check before turning in, it would have traveled across the floor to the far wall. A slow journey of light that happened every clear night, and that I had watched more times than I could count. I ran my hand along the bars. The iron was cool and smooth where countless hands had gripped and rubbed and polished it to a dull sheen. There were scratches on some of the bars, marks left by men who had sat in that cell and passed the time by scraping at the iron with whatever they had, a belt buckle, a button, a fingernail. Most of the marks were shallow and meaningless, just the idle work of restless hands. But one of them, on the third bar from the left, was deeper than the rest. A series of lines that might have been tally marks, counting days maybe, or maybe nothing at all. Just the same line drawn over and over by someone with nothing else to do. I let go of the bars and went back to the desk. The cloth was on the shelf where I'd left it, and I picked it up again and wiped down the surface of the desk one more time. Not because it needed it, but because the motion soothed me, the way any repeated and familiar action soothes, the same way the rocking chair down the street was soothing whoever sat in it, the same way the cricket in the brush soothed itself by singing the same note over and over into the dark. The front door was still open, and through it I could see the lantern on its shelf, still burning, still steady. The night air came in through the doorway, cooler now, carrying the last traces of the day's heat and the growing presence of the hours to come. The deep, still hours when even the dogs sleep, and the only movement in the world is the slow wheel of stars overhead. I went back out to the porch. The rocking chair down the street had gone quiet. Whoever had been sitting there had gone inside, and the silence was more complete now, a silence so thorough that I could hear the lantern's flame, the soft, continuous hiss of it, a sound you don't notice when there's anything else to listen to, but that becomes quite clear when there isn't. Like the sound of your own breathing in an empty room, it was a sound that was always there, always underneath the others, just waiting for the quiet to let it be heard. I leaned forward in my chair and looked closely at the lantern. The flame was burning clean and straight, no sign of the flicker that had caught my attention earlier. The glass chimney had a warmth to it. Not hot to the touch, but warm, like a cup that's been sitting near the stove. And through it the flame appeared slightly softened, its edges blurred by the curve of the glass, so that it looked less like a flame and more like a glow, an emanation, a small concentrated piece of warmth that existed for no other reason than to push back the dark by a few feet in every direction. I thought about Sheriff Dalton then. The way he used to sit in this same chair, in this same spot, looking at this same lantern, or one like it. He'd been the sheriff of Cottonwood Creek for years before I came on as deputy. A quiet man with a face like the land itself, weathered and creased and patient. He didn't talk much, but when he did, what he said tended to stick with you the way a burr sticks to the leg of your trousers. Not because it was sharp or clever, but because it was true. And true things have a way of holding on. He told me once, early on, before I'd learned the rhythms of the job, that the hardest part of being a lawman in a small town wasn't the trouble. The trouble, when it came, was simple enough. You dealt with it, and it was done. The hardest part, he said, was the waiting, the long stretches of nothing, night after night, where the only company was the sound of your own thoughts and the slow turning of the hours. He said some men couldn't take it. Said the quiet got inside them and turned to restlessness, and the restlessness turned to impatience, and the impatience turned to a kind of anger that had no object, just a general dissatisfaction with the way the world insisted on being calm when they wanted it to be otherwise. But if you can learn to sit with the quiet, he said, if you can find the good in it, then you'll do fine. Because the quiet's not empty, son. It's full of things. You just have to learn how to hear them. I thought about that, sitting there on the porch with the lantern burning beside me, and the street dark and the stars getting brighter as the last remnants of twilight drained out of the western sky. I thought about what he'd meant by full of things, and I thought that maybe this was one of those things this evening. This particular arrangement of silence and light and the memory of a flame that flickered twice and then didn't. A thing so small it barely qualified as an event, but a thing nonetheless. A point in the long line of nights that I would carry with me afterward, not because it changed anything, but because I was there for it, because I was paying attention when it happened, because I was sitting still enough to notice. The stove was behind me in the office. I could feel the absence of its heat, which might sound like a strange thing to say, but on cool nights in the other seasons, I was accustomed to feeling its warmth against my back through the open door, and the absence of that warmth was its own kind of presence, a reminder of the season, of where we were in the long, slow turning of the year. I got up and walked to the end of the porch, where the railing turned the corner, and I could look down the side of the building toward the back lot, and beyond it, the edge of town, where the land opened up. The stable was back there, a low wooden structure with a sloped roof and a wide door that was always left ajar on warm nights so the horses could get air. I couldn't see it clearly in the dark, but I could smell it. That deep, warm, grainy smell of horse and hay and leather. That was one of the most comforting smells I knew. A smell that said, everything's in order. Everything's fed and watered and bedded down for the night. I thought about walking back there to check on the horses, but decided against it. The horses were fine. I could feel it from where I stood. The way you can sometimes feel the well-being of another living thing without seeing it, just from the quality of the silence that surrounds it. A horse that's comfortable makes a different kind of quiet than a horse that's nervous. The comfortable kind is looser, more expansive, like it has room to breathe. The nervous kind is tight, compressed, full of small movements and adjustments. The quiet, coming from the stable tonight, was the comfortable kind, and I let it be. Back in the chair, I noticed that the moon had come up, or rather, I noticed its effect because the moon itself was behind the jail out of my line of sight. But its light was arriving, a pale wash that changed the character of the street the way a second lantern changes a room, not doubling the light, but adding to it in a way that shifted the proportions of shadow and brightness and created new edges where there had been only gradual dark. The road, which had been a featureless channel, now had texture. The moonlight picking out the slight ridges and hollows in the dust, the parallel lines left by wagon wheels, the scattered dark spots where horses had stood and shifted their weight. The boardwalks were bright now, pale strips of wood that stood out clearly against the darker ground, and the fronts of the buildings had gained a kind of depth they lacked in full dark. The window frames and door sills and porch posts all becoming visible as separate elements rather than blending into a single flat plane. It was like watching a photograph develop, the details emerging slowly from the general dark, each one taking its place in the composition of the scene. I sat and watched this happen. The moon climbed higher, though I couldn't see it climb, and the light grew stronger, and the street revealed itself in stages, each stage a little more defined than the last, until I could make out individual boards on the boardwalk across the way, and the shape of the watering trough at the hitching post, and the handle of the mercantile's door, a small, bright curve of brass that caught the moonlight and held it like a jewel. And I thought, not for the first time, how much of this job was about seeing, not just looking, but seeing, noticing the small things, the details, the way light fell and shadows formed and objects occupied their spaces, because a thing out of place is only out of place if you know where it belongs, and you only know where it belongs if you've spent enough time watching it in its right position to recognize the difference. This is what I mean when I say the quiet is full of things. It's full of the positions of things, the arrangements, the patterns of light and dark and sound and silence that make up the world when the world isn't doing anything in particular. And knowing those patterns, really knowing them in your body and your bones, is what lets you notice when something changes, even when the change is as small as a lantern flame that hesitates for half a breath and then goes on. The night deepened. The sounds contracted, pulling inward, getting smaller and softer. The cricket behind me slowed its rhythm, the intervals between its chirps lengthening until each one seemed to come from further away, as if the insect were walking slowly backward into the brush, carrying its song with it. The grass sounds from beyond town had faded to a whisper so faint I might have been imagining it, and the sign down by the livery had stopped its creaking entirely, hanging motionless on its chain. I was getting tired, the kind of tiredness that comes not from exertion, but from sustained attention, from the slow expenditure of focus that accumulates over the course of an evening spent watching and listening and holding yourself open to whatever the night has to offer. It's a good tiredness, the kind that settles into your limbs like warm sand, heavy and soft and comforting, and it brings with it a willingness to let go of the day, to release your grip on the hours and let them fall away behind you like stones dropped one by one into still water. I stood up, slowly, feeling the stiffness in my knees and the small ache in my lower back that came from sitting too long in a wooden chair. I picked up the lantern from its shelf and carried it inside, setting it on the desk where it would burn until I turned it down for the night. The circle of light on the desktop was familiar and warm, illuminating the closed ledger and the pen and the inkwell and the dark square of the blotter, each object in its accustomed place, each one casting its small shadow on the wood. I went to the front door one last time and stood in the doorway looking out. The street was moonlit and still, a scene of such thorough peacefulness that it felt almost arranged, as if someone had set each element in its place with deliberate care. The buildings and the boardwalks and the road and the sky and the stars and the single far-off coyote that I now heard calling from somewhere out on the open land, a sound so distant it was barely distinguishable from the silence itself, just a thin thread of voice winding through the dark. I listened until the coyote finished and the silence closed over the place where its voice had been, the way water closes over a dropped stone, seamless and complete. And then I shut the door, gently turning the knob so the latch wouldn't click too loudly, as if I were afraid of waking someone, though there was no one there to wake. The lantern on the desk burned on. I turned the wick down, slowly, watching the flame shrink and the shadows grow, the room contracting around me like a hand closing gently, until the light was just a faint orange glow, barely enough to see by, a last small holdout against the dark that would soon take the whole room. I thought about the two flickers again. I don't know why. There was no reason to think about them, nothing to figure out, nothing to resolve. They were just a thing that had happened, 2 moments when the flame had dimmed and the dark had leaned in, and then the flame had come back, and the dark had retreated, and the evening had gone on as evenings do, without incident, without urgency, without any need for the man sitting on the porch to do anything more than notice. But I carried them with me. I carried them the way I carried the sound of the cricket and the smell of the sage and the feel of the cool iron bars under my hand and the slow creaking of the rocking chair down the street. I carried them because they were part of the evening, and the evening was part of the long chain of evenings that made up my life in Cottonwood Creek, and every link in that chain was worth holding on to. Not because it was special, but because it was mine. I settled onto the cot in the corner of the office. The mattress was thin, and the frame had a sag in the middle that I'd long since adapted to. My body finding the shape of it the way a river finds the shape of its bed, not fighting the contour, but following it, letting it hold me. The blanket was rough wool, scratchy against my chin where I pulled it up, and it smelled of the cedar shavings I kept in the trunk at the foot of the cot. A clean, dry smell that I associated with rest and with the ending of things, the way each day ends and becomes the foundation for the next. The lantern on the desk was very low now, almost out, just a tiny point of orange that wavered at the tip of the wick like the last star of morning, the one that hangs on longest before the dawn overtakes it. I watched it from the cot, lying on my side with my head on the folded blanket that served as a pillow, and I let my eyes grow heavy. The room was warm and close and quiet. Through the walls, I could hear the night, the vast, patient night of the desert, with its slow winds and its far-off animal voices, and its million stars turning overhead in patterns that had been turning since before there were men to watch them, and would go on turning long after there were none. And somewhere in the middle of all that, in a small wooden building, on a dusty street, in a town that most maps didn't bother to include, a lantern flame burned down to nothing, and a man closed his eyes, and the dark came in like a friend who'd been waiting outside the door all along, patient, unhurried, welcome. Well, friends, that's about as much as I have for tonight. The fire here has done what fires do, burned itself down to the quiet part, to the part that glows without trying to. And I reckon that's where I'll leave things. Just sitting here a while longer, feeling the warmth on my hands, grateful for the company, grateful for the still air and the late hour, and the fact that the world is good enough to hold us while we rest. If you've a mind to come back and sit with me another evening, I'd be glad of it. There's always room beside the fire, and there's always something to remember. But for now, let your eyes close if they want to. Let the night do its work. And I'll be right here, same as always, keeping watch on nothing much at all.